Seems like we need an entry for day in the doc. Go ahead and make that. You don't do RFC review and release plenty of stuff today, right?
Nah, we moved it to yesterday. We just try to succumb as many people as possible to sit through it. On the plus side, there is lots of carryover from yesterday.
Yeah, should be good conversation today. I forget all of what we wanted to talk about. I think maybe offline build packages and maybe experimental mode and maybe stack packs. If folks remember what they
Yeah, I think
want
we
to talk
bumped
about.
stack packs and experimental.
I think I'm good on stack packs right now, unless Joe has some outstanding questions he wants to talk about. But I think technically I'm unblocked.
I feel like we reached an end point for now on the offline build packages as well. Until we come back and support both file formats or talk about it. Seems like we could talk about it further offline.
Yeah, the most important thing for stack packs is actually experimental API. I think that Jesse's like making some really good progress to where we can get something merged, but before we can do that, we have to know what guards to put around it so that we have the right, so that we adhere to whatever that RFC ends up describing.
I don't know, may have to bring it back to the drawing board depending on how people like it. Should we start there, Stephen?
Yeah, that sounds good. Let's do it.
Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
I guess, has everyone had a chance to read this? Should I go through it first? I know I've heard we have not presented this at the one of the working group meetings.
Might be good to go over a high level.
Cool. So this is an RFC based off of, I guess, Emily's RFC from adding support and deprecated modes from, I think it's now 49 is what the number ended up being. And she pulled out experimental because it wasn't needed immediately. And this was kind of the result of some of the conversations we had, but then me thinking about it more. And so there's that other kind of experimental kind of RFC as well that Joe started that is kind of built more around, I think, the platform team and Pack. and this one is one that is specific to kind of just APIs, and so that impacts lifecycle pretty heavily of in that regard. So the idea is that we want a way to be able to kind of test out APIs, especially kind of on our road to 1.0, the ability to test out things and have them out in the wild and have people to be actually play with them without having to like build their own life cycle and kind of put that into their own builder and whatnot. And so instead of 1.0 being this thing of stuff that we think will work, it will hopefully actually be tested a little more than that. And so providing a path to potentially do that. So this is just one straw man of how I was thinking about it. So I want to have inside a lifecycle TOML way to kind of specify experimental modes for both Buildpack and platform, since they're two different specifications that have two different versioning schemes. And one of the things that I settled on was basically this alphanumeric kind of thing where it makes it really clear that this is not this is experimental and not like the normal kind of versions that we're supporting. It just kind of helps make that clear. There's a bunch of open questions, I think, that I haven't answered that are around like, what does it mean? Like, what is support policy around experimental? How do we want to deprecate and kind of remove them? Because I think Emily raised some concerns that make a lot of sense around like, we don't just want to have these things hang around forever, but we also don't want to just like rip them out from under people if they're depending on it. So what's the kind of the balance that looks like? And I think both Javier and Emily expressed potentially just not even having experimental as a explicit kind of section and just putting them inside of supported and deprecated. I think some of the arguments potentially around doing that is, I think maybe we want experimental to be on kind of a different cadence and life cycle and not necessarily go through the supported and deprecated thing that we treat normal versions, but maybe we do. But outside of that, it follows along kind of very similar to the RFC that Emily put forward around like the modes and warning and errors that a platform could set, or Buildpack could set, or a platform could set for kind of how it wants to treat. Like maybe a platform never wants to support experimental. So if you use experimental features, you can like fail that for like a Buildpack API. So yeah, I think more or less that is like the bulk of the main proposal. And then I listed some kind of alternatives of like, we could drop the alphanumeric thing if we don't think we want to do it that way. There's probably a more limited one around unstable features that are not tied to specific versions. So right now, experimental is tied to like these like alpha or what have you kind of spec versions that are on unreleased branches. And we potentially could try to separate out specific features into kind of these unstable features, which I think matches more similar to kind of the platform experimental thing where they're flags and then you can kind of turn them on and off as a user. So they'd be a little more cross-cutting. I think that does limit potentially the scope of the kind of features we could put into experimental, because they'd have to be kind of, you'd have to minimize the impact across the entire spec to make sure you can't extract it. But that, that's an alternative. Potentially we can do both. So I don't think it's a one either or. But yeah, that's probably the quick overview of the RFC. And I'll open it up for discussion and comments.
I have a question. So sort of in the original RFC where I proposed experimental, what distinguished it from supported or deprecated was that it wasn't the definition of that API, like what was supported, could change between releases sort of without warning. So it's the kind of thing that you wouldn't necessarily depend on, or that we weren't giving people a guarantee that we wouldn't break later. It wasn't until something moved into supported that we were making a guarantee that you could use it and expect it to behave the same way in the next release. In your vision of this now, where you have like an experimental that's 1.0 alpha 1, between releases of the lifecycle, would we change the definition of that? Or if we wanted to change an experimental API, would we need like a 1.0 alpha 2? Like, are these immutable APIs?
I guess I was thinking originally of just making them immutable because I think just makes it easier for users to follow of just like you could check potential, like maybe there's a thing where you can see what is in alpha 1 and then what is in alpha 2. I'm also open to like if we release a new version of the lifecycle that would change it. The equivalent would be we remove alpha 1 as the version, and then you only get alpha 2, and then explicitly like you have to just change that the platform, like on the platform side. It's kind of a more conscious decision there. But yeah,
I have I think it's very much along those lines, but I guess a more, or like a stepping back a little bit, semantic question about it. When we say experimental API in that list, to me that communicates like the life cycle has experimental support for this API version, right? And when you take an API version and you put -alpha at the end, to me that says this API version is an experimental API itself, right? But those mean like totally different things. One means in the implementation of this component, I've experimentally attempted to implement this particular version of the API that's a real version of the API that's defined as it is, and my implementation of it is somehow experimental. It's maybe not ready to go yet, it hasn't met all of the requirements yet, right? And then if you have a like -alpha something in the version number itself, to me that communicates this definition, the way this is specified is experimental. We may change how it's specified in the future, if that makes sense. It seems like we're talking about the specification. It's not clear to me if we're talking about the implementation or the specification is experimental. I think we're talking about the specification, and if that's the case, I wonder why. Like, does it make sense to call it out as an experimental field within the component itself, where you'd imagine that would be talking about the component? Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're trying to separate basically like implementation from like the API.
Yeah, it's like if 1.0 alpha 1 is an experimental version of 1.0, right, or 1.0, right? If 1.0 alpha 1 is an experimental version of 1.0, then it seems like that's something that the lifecycle can either support or not support, right? And whether it's the component doesn't decide whether it's experimentally supported. And because this descriptor comes with a component, like I'm not sure I understand what the meaning of the having a separate field is. Does that sort of make sense? It seems like if you want to pass a flag through that says this is you can only run experimental versions here, and we're modifying the version numbers to reflect that the versions themselves are experimental, then that's how we should key on making that determination.
Yeah, I was definitely mixed a little bit on the experimental key. I think it just made it clearer. I think for some of it as well, like for like the supported key, like I feel like supported, like at least the name of supported versus like, I think if the word was available versus supported, I would feel differently about that. But I feel like supported implies like some level of support maybe by just the name. I don't know if that makes sense, Stephen.
I think I get what you're saying, but it's like if the life cycle guarantees that it, or the word supported there to me, when you put an alpha version next to it, implies that the life cycle is saying, yes, we we totally implemented this alpha version of the API. Like, we think it is exactly right. We will support the API itself, maybe crap, right? Like, it may not work, right, to solve your problems, but it matches what the specification says. And so if we're going to introduce an experimental field there, like, and maybe the problem is that supported is too strong a word, and we could think about that. But if we're going to introduce experimental there, in this context, I really read it as like the implementation we've done in the life cycle itself. Like, it'd be a way to say, like, here we have experimental support for 1.0, which would mean like we tried to implement the 1.0 spec, but there might still be broken stuff. So only use the life cycle for 1.0 at your own risk. And I don't know if, like, kind of stepping back further, I don't know which of those two things we actually want. Well, we might not actually want experimental specification versions. We may want to say that, like, we think we specified 1.0 really well, and that's the normal case, and we've added support to the lifecycle for it, but we're not sure if it really works super well yet, so we're going to put that experimental field, and that might be what we need, but that means not versioning the APIs differently, right? Or we might be saying we're not sure about some spec changes we've made, and we've released an alpha version of the spec or whatever. And does that sort of make sense?
Yeah.
That distinction makes a lot of sense to me. I think an example of the latter case where we're not sure about the spec is the current stackback conversation, right? I think we want to have a thing people can try before we're sure exactly what the spec for that looks like. Does that fit with everyone's understanding?
Do we release experimental versions of the spec, or do we release experimental, really Buildpack and platform API versions? I know we use tags to represent those in GitHub or something now. Do we tag those as alpha something?
That was my original thought. Obviously, it's just a thought, and people need to buy in. But yeah, I mean, I think I was going along with basically what Emily was thinking as well with some of the stack pack stuff. Is like, I think we feel good about the stack pack stuff, but it feels like we need to try out some of the not even just, there's for sure I guess, like, from your comment too, Stephen, like, there's both, I feel like sometimes with these experimental APIs, like both the implementation side of it that we want to try and test out, as well as probably how it feels as an API. Like, how do we feel about that, and like the impact on potentially the end user using like stack packs as an example? Do we want to change that? And I feel like both of those things aren't, especially for stack packs, aren't set in stone, and we want a way to get feedback on it in the wild because it solves like a real use case and need, if that makes sense.
It makes sense.
But I agree they are separate things, but I'm curious, like, how often you need to tackle both of those things too. And I'm happy if what we need to do is just remove experimental from and put this into supported. Like, that is not a hill I'm going to die on or anything.
I was actually going to suggest, because we have stack packs as an example of something where we'll probably have an experimental API version and not be incredibly sure that it does what we want, we could do both of those things, but have them mean separate things, right? So you could put 1.0-alpha1 in supported, right? But you could also put 1.0-alpha1 in experimental, and then it's saying it's, there's something implemented here to try to support it, but there are no guarantees even that the implementation matches what that numbered thing is. But that could be a separate RFC. For now, if you're just looking for experimental API versions, like, API versions where the version itself communicates that this is not ready to go yet, like 1.0-alpha1, then my preference would be to put that in the supported column.
So what is the value of the field? It seems like that's what we're talking about, right? And how would it actually be used outside of just human comprehension? Like, I know for deprecated, we could throw out, deprecation warnings when you're using a certain API. Do we anticipate doing the same thing for experimental?
I think that's the major use case, is automatically informing the user or forcing the user to take some action before they're allowed to use the dangerous thing.
I see.
To me, that separation of implementation and specification is important in that context specifically because it communicates like if the user is using some functionality that might be broken, right, that feels like a different kind of warning to the user than the user's using a well implemented specification, but they're a build pack author and that spec could change later and you need to be aware that like, hey, they might need to re-implement what they're doing because they're contextually pretty different scenarios.
So I guess, Stephen, is there a case where you would have, so I think the experimental being implementation makes sense, and potentially you can have even stable specs, right? Like say we stabilize 1.0 and we're happy with it, but like we're unsure on implementation, or maybe like StackPack is a good example, right? Like whatever the next API that actually makes it out in, say like 0.7 or whatever, right? And we feel good about it, but the API and it makes it, and then we just move it into experimental. I think that case is clear. What does it mean to have like the experimental, it's like well implemented, but the spec is not? I guess like we're still sorting out the spec, but the implementation, I feel like that use case, at least in my head right now, is a little fuzzy.
I think it's still like maybe some like real world examples of this are like TOML right now. Like TOML is at 100 RC2, but the different implementations of RC2 are actually really good. They meet that spec exactly. They're just not sure upstream if they want to change any of the definitions for what 100 is. Like I could see a world where we get stack packs or we get stack packs down really implemented really well, right? Conoco's behaving very nicely. We're doing all the snapshotting and everything. It's not nothing we'd worry about somebody using in its current state, right? But we want more feedback before we say like, because of the performance implications and things like that, we want some more real world feedback before we want to like turn it on for all users automatically with no warnings for everybody to use, right? So I can see use cases around that for us, and some real world examples of it. I do think because there can be a lot of implementations of a spec, right? I feel like it's a useful separation in for all four of the combinations.
I want to call out that for both of these paths forward that we're discussing, for something like stack packs, we're talking about basically cutting a spec release before we let it into the life cycle, even if that spec release is an alpha, describes an alpha version of the spec. And as a lifecycle maintainer, that makes sense to me on some level, because if we're going to say we're going to take this API and it's going to be supported, and eventually we're going to deprecate it, and we need to support it alongside other versions, I do want us to get it out there with some level of confidence that we aren't going to kill ourselves trying to support this, because it was hastily, we didn't think through all of the details. But that isn't necessarily what we've been talking about recently wanting to do with stack packs, which is just like get something out there so people can try it. Does that make sense?
You don't know what API version you would put in that field, because we want to ship it in the packs CLI and just be like, it's a thing, go try it, right?
Like, imagine how we would do stack packs with this, and let's say we took the experimental field out and we were having experimental APIs. So we say, oh, we think eventually stack packs are going to ship in Buildpack API 07, but we aren't exactly sure what we want the API to look like. So we'll, at a certain point, we'll call something 07 alpha 1, and the lifecycle will implement that, and then people can try it out. I feel like that's a fine path forward, but it's not the path forward we've been talking about, which was more informal than that. So I just want to make sure everyone is like on board with the implications of that, because it's like nailing down at least what we think an alpha version of the spec is in the spec itself.
do we need to actually release the alpha versions of the spec? I guess we tag the commits right now. It'll be weird if we're referencing a version that's not a tagged commit.
I was
But would it
imagining
be
what we
that
could
weird?
do is stay on the branch, but tag the branch for alpha and not merge until you cut 07. Might be a way to do it. But you
Yeah,
also
I mean-
then need to be confident you're going to finish stack packs. Like that means we're not going to cut 07 unless we have solved stack packs
I don't think
enough
that's
that we want to
necessary.
call it
I mean,
07, right?
you can cut it out of
Yeah.
It's an alpha release, right? Like maybe stack packs need, like worst case scenario, right? Like stack packs, we got useful feedback and it was not what we wanted. It needs to go maybe back to the drawing board or something, right? Like, and then we just bump that out of 0.7, right?
Without it, and then potentially an 07 experimental alpha thing that still has the same stack pack stuff, right? But it doesn't have to go into the next release.
I do think it gets a little weird if we want to make other changes in 07. We would have merged all this stuff into this branch, then we'll rip it out. And then the life cycle, because we don't want to hard drop an API on the ground between releases without at least telling people it's going to be removed, we'd be supporting 07 alpha version of stack packs and 07 that has no stack packs, then like an 08 alpha that has a slightly different version of stack packs. It starts to get a little weird, right?
Okay, so I'm losing track of when you're talking about the spec and when you're talking about the implementation. You're talking about a tag in the spec that has everything from that experimental branch or whatever, right? And that doesn't mean
what experimental branch?
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm asking.
Because if we're calling this an alpha, I feel like it can't proceed independently of the rest of 07, right?
Well, yeah, that's actually a good question, right? Like I was asking, are experimentals linear or is it a forking thing? Like, could we have an experimental stack packs and an experimental inline build packs and an experimental offline packages that all kind of go, like maybe the offline packages experimental doesn't, like you can't use stack packs with offline build packs. See what I mean?
Like if we start treating these sort of as unstable features rather than alpha versions of the next API, we run into like combinatorial explosion problems where like, okay, so I want to use the experimental stack packs, but with which API, and do they all have the right information there? It starts making lifecycle hideously complicated.
No, yeah, I'm definitely not advocating for the forking. I actually like the linear better, in part because I think it makes it easier to deal with in the code. Like we can just put everything in main and be pretty confident that it's either going to stay experimental, but but like that way we get to have everything play with each other well in advance of a release. But if we're doing that, then maybe that changes how we approach the spec, and that we might want to keep them separated in the spec so that we could move forward without mainlining something. Does that make sense? I'm asking because I'm not sure it makes sense to me.
I don't totally understand what keeping them separate looks like.
Yeah, I can go
practically.
with what Emily said.
Yeah.
Are you thinking of like there's 0.7 and there's like 0.7 alpha or 0.7 stack packs? That is a fork off of alpha, and that, or off of 0.7, you have to like merge stuff back into the upstream that is the 0.7 branch.
I think what I'm saying is no. I think what I'm saying is that like they wouldn't map that, like I don't know. I think if I look at the spec, I want to be able to see a diff of what is new from stack packs, independent of offline build packages or anything else, right? Regardless of what we call whether we call it alpha or whatever. And maybe that means we don't actually tag that. Like maybe alpha is like a collection of those diffs. I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with that. Like the things that are important to me are that like we are able to put the different experiments in the same branch in the code, and that, yeah. And then maybe that that I can see the diff in the spec, although I'm not married to that.
So you want to separate like stack packs and offline build packs from other changes going into the spec that are not experimental?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you have to like rebase and things like that, but I can't figure out, like, I'm trying to think through it now, but like I can't figure out how that corresponds to how we do like naming of the branch or tagging in the spec. I don't know.
You need feature branches.
Sort of. It's like, I think it's like I want to push that complexity into the spec rather than having it in the implementation, if that makes sense. And maybe that's like a false dichotomy. Maybe it's a concern that like doesn't actually exist, but it seems like it could be.
Stack packs as an extension spec.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too, actually. But I haven't really thought it through. Like, is the mechanism that everything that is experimental starts as an extension, or similar? Like maybe we have a separate experimental directory.
Well, I think at that point, you need to make sure that those experimental extensions have the right like seams, right? There might be some where the seam doesn't exist and it has to be incorporated with a pre-existing phase, in which case I don't think that would be possible.
Oh, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's just words, right? Like we see that in, I think, in Project Toml a little bit, where it's like you have to reference something that is in the mainline spec or like duplicate it. Like, yeah, I agree. There's like this weird, there could be these, like not everything is completely separate, and it has to account for those parts where it overlaps. Like it's like anything that's an extension or would be a separate experimental directory is not the kind of thing that you could just hit the merge button on.
Well, I guess I was thinking more like, yes, they are words, but like for right now, the extension specs live on their own. So like they're a very separate document, right? And I guess I'm thinking more if this extension changes the behavior that then the main line says works a very different way.
Yeah, and I'm saying copy paste those sections and rewrite them in the extension.
Oh, I see. Okay.
You know what I mean? Like, yeah, like that's what I mean by it's just words. Like, yes, that means you can't just like simply merge them. Like actually moving it from experimental into the core spec would require reworking them in the sense of like reworking the prose.
I think what you're suggesting though there, Joe, is kind of like unstable features though, right? Like you're kind of separating.
Yeah.
Because like you're basically saying I want to be able to flag in, because if you're rewriting parts of the main spec in experimental, like no matter how small it is, it means that like there has to be a way for me to run this without having that kind of behavior turned on, right? Like, because if I go and read, say, the 0.7 whatever alpha spec, and there's an extension that is stack packs, but it impacts like the behavior of how it works, and I read that and I think it works this way, but if it's always on and it actually behaves this separate way, like I think you kind of lose the benefit of putting it in a separate doc, because now the main spec is wrong.
Well, I feel like
branch.
what the extension describes has to not contradict directly the main spec. It has to be complementary with it.
Right. I think that like similar to unstable features though, that really limits what you can and can't do. Right. Like if that is true, if what Joe wants is true, then you should be able to flag in and out.
Yeah, that's true. And maybe I'm thinking of it, I'm really thinking of it about like stack packs, which works that way, but not necessarily everything does. So maybe I'm thinking about it too narrowly.
Maybe there are some things for which it's worth it, even though that is a high bar to clear. I feel like either way, we're not off the hook, right? I think we can make it such that you either have to specify everything up front, and then you can merge it into the normal spec, or if you want it to behave like an experimental feature, that happens through extension specs. But that is difficult in its own way, and we probably wouldn't do that often if we could help it, right? It's only when it's worth it because of the complexity.
What makes the extension stuff complex if it's a clean separation?
Making sure that it is a clean separation is the complex part, or that's the burden, right? You can't.
And not always desirable too, right? Like, yeah, I think personally I'm thinking about it too much in the context of stack packs where that is achievable, right? Like if you turn off stack packs, everything should work the way it normally does. But that is definitely not true for other things. And that like, in a way that we might not want, like we might want the experimental thing to be something that is antithetical to the way it is today, right?
I think if we did what you're talking about with stack packs sort of being like a feature or an extension, that wouldn't go in experimental. That doesn't intersect with anything that's here. That's like another API that's in the list, right? It's like stack packs 01.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It gets weird though, because it is also like part of the Buildpack API and part of the platform API. It's a little bit of a cop out, but I think we could mostly make it work.
Is that what you prefer to do? And we just scrap this RFC?
I don't know.
I think this RFC to the place we would take it, I think, which is the ability to put alpha versions in the list of supported things, is more like an RFC about pre-release functionality, right? To say the lifecycle can work on a pre-release version of the spec, and that would mean that we should cut pre-release versions of the spec, have linear pre-releases, use it in order to demo, a version of the specification that's flowing linearly, generally, right? That where we're just not sure if we're ready to cut the next release yet, right? If we find that functionality useful for the types of things we're about to launch, then I think is a good RFC, if that makes sense. If we don't find that functionality useful in the short term, then we could wait on it until we need that kind of sort of linear pre-release functionality. If we want to run stack packs through the kind of linear pre-release functionality, then I'd say that could be a reason to keep going. If we want to do something different with stack packs, where it's more like this is something that's optional for platforms to implement as we continue to release the spec separately and run new versions of it that you would tack on top that's still experimental as an extension, right? Then I don't think, like, at least in the way this is described right now, it seems like it's not exactly the right thing. It's like we'd want an extensions key that says this also implements these extensions, right? And then probably versions for those extensions that it implements and all of that is my take. But I'm not super strongly opinionated.
Yeah, I guess regardless of stack packs, and regardless if we do this now or later, I feel like we would want this for 1.0.
To be able to have that linear 1.0 release that we're testing for a while before we cut it. Exactly.
Like more than stack packs, I think we want it for 1.0, but it doesn't mean we have to do it today.
And what we want for 1.0 is really about an experimental API. It's like a pre-release API version, not pre-release functionality in pack, right? And so I'd say, like, if you move the experimental stuff to the supported flag, we could get this through for helping with 1.0, but it may not cover the stack pack use cases. Would be my gut.
Yeah, I guess there's questions for me around like I definitely hear like Emily's concern of like some of the complexity of like supporting a bunch of API modes too. And I want them, and maybe this is like on a case by case basis, and that's out of scope of this RC. But like, what are people's gut feeling of supporting, like, say we do a 1.0 alpha 1, right? Like, and then we do a 1.0 alpha 2. Like, what is the expectation that we want to give our users of like, are we going to support alpha 1? Like, how long is that supported, right? Does it go through the same supported deprecated thing where we deprecate it on the next release, then it gets removed on the third release, or like, what do we want that policy to be?
Yeah, there's definitely complexity in there we'd want to figure out also.
I guess my question is, what kind of thing would we want in 1.0 alpha 1 versus in like an 0.9, right?
Yeah.
Because it's anything that, like with a hard break, that we can't make compatible with something that like made two build packs unable to be in a group together. That's sort of the only case I can think where I'd want something in an alpha for 1.0 rather than in a new minor.
Seems right to me.
So can I talk through how this might work with StackPack specifically, and then see how it works? Because I'm trying to write it down, and I think I don't even completely understand.
You're thinking, sorry, just to understand, you're saying how this might work for StackPacks if it switched to an extension?
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So
I want to propose an alternative to it switching to an extension, but you should talk first. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, I'm not really, I don't know what I want. Okay, so we want an experimental Heroku builder, or we want a builder that for Heroku that offers the opportunity to run a stack pack, right? So we create a builder that has lifecycle 0.10.0-alpha. Is that right? Am I on the right track?
I have alpha life cycles. So
What's that? Well, first let's say, okay, so first we merge the stack pack PR into main, and it has a bunch of if statements guarding the flags and whatnot. And the criteria would be if the version is equal to my experimental version, whatever it is.
the lifecycle version.
Yes. Does that
Equal
sound
to your
right?
experimental. So you'd be releasing a different lifecycle artifact than 0.10.0.
Yes. Yeah, so let me back up even more. So to the stack pack PR, we add a new constant in API that is like 0.10.0-alpha. And that gets added to the list of supported platform and, oh wait, no, this is really about the platform and Buildpack APIs.
Yeah, we don't really use the lifecycle version itself to make these calculations right now.
I think this is going to get very complicated if we're thinking about experimental versions of those, including an extension that then move forward to subsequent versions. I have a simpler, maybe controversial suggestion, but that I think might help. So in the end, if we choose to make separate extensions, right, and version those extensions differently, right, like out of band of the normal release process, we end up creating a separate extensions version number, right? Or like that's the logical conclusion of that is now we need to version this thing that's running out of band separately, right? And then you end up with multiple.
One clarification point: when you say this thing, are you talking about
APIs?
The
so
spec? So like we'd have a stack pack API 01 that we're versioning separately. That's what you're talking about.
Right. we'd end up with a StackPack API and have to version that separately from versioning the Buildpack API or the platform API. But realistically, you're talking about two components, and they need one version number to communicate. And I think we're over optimizing by creating multiple contractual version numbers between those components, when really it's one version number that describes
Which two components?
Either the lifecycle and the platform or the lifecycle and the build pack. In each of those contracts, you have a thing on each side, right? And I think one version number is probably enough to describe the support contract between those two things. And so as an alternative to creating multiple version numbers, we could, and as an alternative to submitting stack packs as an extension into the spec, right? We could submit stack packs into the spec proper, right? And have the wording of the spec reflect that stack packs are experimental. Then we release the spec as normal, right? Or the spec is already pre-release anyways, right? Adding a point something, bumping the point something minor in the future would indicate that we've added an additional feature, right? We can't use the version numbers to communicate this state, right? But we can use the formal definition of the spec as a specification to communicate it. And so,
and then a lifecycle is just experimental, true or false. Because I don't think a lifecycle should have to implement the experimental stuff to be compliant, but it could say whether it has the experimental stuff for a given API.
This is why we have may in the spec, right?
Yeah.
Then this could be a proper part of the spec that is documented. We can bump all the version numbers. We can treat it like normal. We don't have to deal with any of these problems, if that makes sense. We sacrifice a little bit of using version numbers to communicate things very clearly, because the version number won't have alpha or whatever in it, but it seems like that we're never going to be able to communicate clearly what we want here, because it really does run out of the band of the thing. And we can use the ability for the spec to define itself as whatever it wants to be, right, in order to add an additional feature that just gets integrated normally. And then we don't have to deal with the problem, I think.
So very similarly, we could do exactly that. And then instead of like an experimental on-off, we could still use the alphanumeric, like dash alphanumeric on the platform version to mean something like that, or have like different versions of experimental. Does that make sense? Like we could still use 05 dash stack pack or 05 dash alpha and have that mean something in the lifecycle code, right? Like there could be like part of the specification could say that that extension to the version causes something to happen or change.
I think introducing that extension to the version creates the complexity where it's difficult to understand what we're releasing, if that makes sense, and what the next version would be. But it doesn't mean that you couldn't communicate this very clearly in other ways, right? So you could release the next spec version. Inside of the spec, say, the following, have a separate page that says the following features are experimental features within this proper API version. To enable them, you must pass, the platform must pass this flag in this way, or like this, the user must opt into them explicitly, and they may change in subsequent API versions. The usual guarantee that we don't make breaking changes is not applicable to this section in the spec, right? And then no, you couldn't use, you couldn't denote that in the version number of the contract itself. But like, again, I think as soon as you start messing with that too much, we end up with a lot of complexity in how we want to integrate that change into future versions and when we're going to drop it. The user could still very clearly have to indicate that they're opting into that feature by something that we've defined in the spec that's very clear to the user.
Yeah, I mean, this sounds a lot like the unstable feature stuff, but it's just, I mean, it's in the spec, the mainline spec. I guess the downside to some degree is like, if you say have 0.7 and you have like iteration 1 of stack packs at experimental, and then you have 0.8 that also has an experimental version of stack packs, and they function wildly differently because we've learned stuff from the 0.7 thing. Does lifecycle need to support both?
Well, because we said it's experimental and users had to pass this flag that's like, I understand that this will probably break in the future if I change anything, right? I'd say
But is that weird when you go to the spec and you're like, I pull down this version of lifecycle and I'm using 0.7, I go read the spec, are we going to update the spec to reflect the new changes in the experimental, or is it just going to be wrong?
We would release, if we release the next version of the spec and the API version, the build pack supports to match that changes, like you'd go to the matching spec version for the version of the lifecycle that you have, if that makes sense.
Right, but I'm saying like if I go back to, if I'm like, I don't want to move to 0.8 of the spec, right, for Buildpack or platform API, right? And we're saying this is experimental, so it can change, right? And does the lifecycle need to maintain the two different implementations of the stack pack feature?
Yes. Yeah, it does.
Or like I feel like what you were saying, Stevens, that like if you maintain one version, it like can change. And if I go back to 0.7 of the spec, that spec is now wrong for the experimental if you only have one implementation, right? Like I feel like that's the downside of what you're suggesting is like you either have to maintain multiple versions of this experimental thing, or you in the life cycle, or like the spec's going to be wrong, right?
In my mind, the way we solve that is just maintaining multiple versions. But I'm more okay taking on maintaining that into the future, knowing that even though we put an experimental section, it went out in a spec release, because I think then the bar is higher for us having thought through whether this is something maintainable for us. Does that make sense? Because we have to release it even though it's in a separate section of the spec. I see that section as giving users an idea of whether they should depend on this in the existing in the future, but it doesn't mean anything different to us in terms of how we want to support it.
Makes sense to me. An alternative is we could not spec this and it be a feature of the lifecycle end of pack that is an experimental feature of the implementation that is not in the specification, right? But then you kind of lose the ability to use the specification versions to, you know, meaningfully indicate that the build pack can or can't support the functionality, and that doesn't
like a
seem
slippery road to go down,
right.
Stephen.
That seems like too far in that direction, right? But
Yeah.
but if we took this to the extreme of what's the easiest, it seems like there's this like spectrum of like very strict, really complicated API versioning with multiple API version lines and extensions and, you know, whatever. And then on the other side, there's like, you know, chaos, right? That doesn't, you know, with no expectation that anything can ever work at any given time with any combination of versions, right? And we're marching this way and realize when we're trying to solve these little problems, right? But I think creating maybe more complexity than necessary when like maybe what we need is something that is version where you still have, you know, a number that represents a contract between the two components, but use the wording of the specification to express that complexity, right? But I see what you're saying about like, well, that means that like when you bump to the next version, things could change completely, right? And so like support Buildpacks says 0.7 versus Buildpacks says 0.8, right? Means we're like the behavior could be very different suddenly, right? And you'd have to ensure that you're looking up the right thing in the lifecycle would have to support both to continue to support 0.7, right?
Yeah.
If it, so
yeah,
like,
I mean,
that's a sacrifice.
depending on how big that diff is and how much you want, like, I guess the trade-off is that, like what Emily's saying, right? It's like it has to be much more stable for us to be okay, even though we're marking it as experimental. So it moves the bar significantly higher.
I mean, because it's experimental though, things can break in different situations, right? So we could say like, because you don't have to implement that feature in 0.7, lifecycle could keep 0.7 around, right? But not keep the stack pack, the old stack pack implementation of 0.7 around because it's optional in 0.7, right? You could actually lose that when we bump lifecycle to the next version. And then build packs on 0.7 with stack packs that are expected to work would stop working. And we could say, well, you know, it's a really
We said it was
experimental feature.
experimental.
you gotta update the life cycle in order to be able to use it with that, right? And then it gives us
Yeah.
the ability to version the life cycle along with the thing if we needed to. So it is flexible and is just as flexible as other ways of doing it, right? It's either it works or it doesn't work when we, like, no matter how we
Right.
slice the versions, it's going to be the same question under the hood. And this is fairly simple, so it's why I'd recommend it. Sorry.
I guess we only have 3 minutes left. I guess for me, like some of the questions is like what I do if that's RC, but also like I think what you're the kind of the trade-off here is like you either want to move the spec versions forward or you want to kind of stabilize a feature before releasing it into a spec, right? Which I guess is what the experimental API is that suggests in my RFC, or like we're hoping 0.7 includes like a much more finalized version of this thing. And so we're having these like kind of alpha or whatever releases, alpha numeric releases, I guess I'll call them, to kind of test that API. And I think that's kind of where the trade-off is there, right?
Yeah.
Or that's not the trade-off, but the difference. Like one is about stabilizing it, so when 0.7 comes out, that the API is hopefully finalized or we feel good about it. Whereas the other one is like we're just gonna carry this kind of thing through multiple versions potentially, right?
Yeah, it's like a long-running experimental feature versus, you know, ensuring that the next release of the specification is what we want it to be before we finalize it. As different goals, right? Yeah.
Maybe we want to do the Wild West version of this instead to keep things simpler. Like instead of picking like an API version, your API version is the string experimental. And what that means is the latest supported plus whatever else. Go nuts. Same with Buildpack API. Because I feel like if it does give us the opportunity to.
Where would who would say that? The build pack would put API equals experimental on its build pack tunnel, or
Yeah.
the user says that somewhere. Okay.
Or the platform says platform API equals experimental. And that's just like a moving target. And
so
you're welcome to design your prod system on it, but it means when you pull in a new lifecycle release, you have to be careful about it. And then it's on you, but you sort of opted in. Whereas if you're in API land, we've like put guardrails so you can't shoot yourself in the foot. And this is saying, I take responsibility for shooting myself in the foot, but I want to be in experimental land.
Yeah, so that's pretty close to what I was trying to say, probably poorly, except that it would be like 0.5 - experimental. And then the implementation would basically split that into experimental, and like at least 0.5 would give you a little bit of control over.
I think the
maybe
combination
not the
of those
absolute
two
newest
things gets confusing to me to understand and hard to implement. I feel like I'm more comfortable with it when its API is experimental, which means whatever. And that gives us the opportunity to try these things out, and people who want to cautiously pull in new lifecycle versions rather than optimistically pull in new lifecycle versions, the chance to try things out. And the fact that they have to use that string gives people an appropriate warning that maybe they shouldn't try it out in prod for their 1 million customers.
I mean, is this just release channels though at this point, right? Like it's like the equivalent of nightly. It's like, please give me nightly.
No, because it's not a different release of the lifecycle.
Different release of the spec though.
It's not a different release of
release.
the spec at all, because we're not specing. We don't have to spec it. We'll just document it in the lifecycle. It's just a lifecycle.
Sure, I mean, but I mean, like for all practical
So-
purposes, like lifecycle is a representation of the implementation of the spec, right? And you're changing the spec whether it's actually released or not as documentation.
Okay, yeah, let me talk through
Yeah,
that one
I
real
gotta
quick.
drop,
Do we have,
though.
oh, we don't have time, yeah. Okay, yeah, I think that's interesting, but I would want to talk through it a bit.
Definitely interested in finding a good solution for this, because I think it's going to get really important for coming up to 1.0. Thanks, everybody.